Welcome to the Deep Dive. Great to have you with us as we jump into another fascinating source you've brought along.
Glad to be here.
And this time, wow, we're tackling something really ambitious. A history of India that covers, well, huge stretches of time.
Yeah, it's pretty monumental. This material takes us right from, the earliest human presence, way before records, basically, all the way through to, well, pretty much modern times. It's an incredible sweep.
It really is. And the source itself, it mentions right up front, it's aimed at students, general readers, trying for a balanced picture. And interestingly, in its own preface, it gives us a peek into the perspectives involved. It notes one author's focus on Indology, history, things like temples, kingship, even Southeast Asia.
Right.
And the other author, more history and philosophy background, freedom movement, agrarian stuff, economic history.
So a real blend of angles.
Exactly. So the material itself tells us we're getting this mix of deep cultural history alongside the political and economic threads.
Precisely. And our mission today, using the source you've provided, is really to dig in and pull out those key insights, the important nuggets, maybe some surprising facts, to help you navigate this huge expanse of Indian history. It's our deep dive into your material.
And it kicks off by even thinking about how we frame history, discussing different ways to periodize it, Western models versus Indian ones.
Sets the stage nicely, doesn't it? Makes you think about time itself before you even start the story.
It does.
So as we go through this, we'll generally follow the source's timeline, more or less chronologically, but we'll definitely keep an eye out for those recurring themes, those patterns that pop up again and again. Try and connect the dots across different eras.
Great. Let's dive right in there, right at the beginning. The source makes this really fundamental point about the environment, how its importance actually changes depending on where humans are in their development.
That's such a crucial starting point. It grounds everything. History isn't just people making choices in a vacuum, right?
No, absolutely.
It's about how we interact with the world around us. So think about those earliest people. The source describes the hunters, the food gatherers, using stone tools.
Right.
Their lives were tied to specific landscapes. They preferred, forest edges, open river valleys, places where they could find what they needed easily.
Which is totally different from the settled farmers who came later.
Completely different mindset, different needs. The settled peasant, they had to clear land, cut down trees, prepare the soil.
Hard work.
Definitely. And initially, they'd go for the lighter soils, the easier stuff to work.
Okay.
The source makes this great point that it really took technological development like sturdy plows, strong draft animals, to finally tackle those heavy, really fertile alluvial plains. You needed that power to unlock the potential of that kind of land.
Oh, that makes perfect sense. You need the tools for the job.
Precisely. And then where you had enough water, either rain or irrigation, you get rice.
Which is super productive.
The most productive grain, the source says, but also the most demanding. Needs a lot of water, a lot of care.
Right.
And this whole agricultural base, it's presented as just absolutely vital. Civilizations, empires, they depended on it.
So if that base crumbled,
it could all just wither away. If the agriculture was devastated, the power structures built on it could collapse. That linked geography, farming, power, it's a core theme right from page 1.
Speaking of early developments, the source obviously discusses the huge discovery of the Indus Valley civilization. Harappa, Mohenjo-daro back in the 1920s.
Oh, absolutely transformative. Before that, the common idea was that the Indo-Aryans were sort of the first major culture there.
Right.
But finding these incredibly sophisticated cities, it just pushed the timeline way, way back, 3rd, 4th millennia BC. Suddenly, India's ancient history is right up there with Egypt and Mesopotamia, the 3rd major early civilization.
And the source gives us some specifics about these places and even sites that came before them, like Mehrgarh.
Yeah, Mehrgarh is fascinating. It predates the big Harappan cities, but it shows this buildup, increasing wealth, signs of urbanization happening between, say, 3000 and 2500 BC.
What kind of signs?
Well, the source mentions things like new kinds of seals with animal symbols appearing, terracotta figurines with really elaborate hairstyles, even realistic sculpture that kind of foreshadows later Harappan art. They were building 2-story buildings and adapting to using cow dung for fuel because wood was getting scarce.
Resourceful. And producing ceramics. Almost like early industry.
Pretty much, yeah, a semi-industrial scale. The source has this fantastic detail about finding a kiln with 200 discarded jars inside.
Wow.
That specific detail really paints a picture, doesn't it? The scale of production, even the waste involved.
It does, and then you see the environment playing a role again in decline, like with Kalibangan.
Exactly. The source tells us New Kalibangan was just abandoned, probably 17th century BC, because the Gagger River dried up. No river, no farming base, no city. Simple as that.
In Lothal, near modern Ahmedabad.
That's thought to be the port. Founded a bit later, maybe 2200 BC. But it clearly shared that Harappan DNA, the Acropolis platform, walls around the lower city, the same street grid as Mohenjo-Daro and Harappa, very planned.
So the big question, how did this amazing civilization end? The source digs into the theories.
Right. Recent research, it says, points towards a pretty sudden decline, maybe between 1800 and 1700 BC.
Sudden, okay.
But, and this is important, that archaeology doesn't really back up that old idea of a massive violent invasion wiping everything out.
No widespread destruction.
Very few traces of last massacres, the source notes, maybe some contested evidence at Mohenjo-Daro itself, but it's not a general pattern across the site.
So it wasn't the Aryans charging in?
Well, the source is pretty clear on that. It says recent research has basically exculpated the Vedic Aryans.
Ah.
They probably arrived centuries after the main cities were already gone or in serious decline.
So what happened then? Internal problems.
It's like it. The excavations show, and the source calls them striking symptoms of endogenous decay during the late Harappan phase.
Endogenous decay. Like what?
Things like settlements being abandoned really suddenly, people just leaving kitchen stuff behind, or other places being resettled, but in a really basic, unplanned way, using broken bricks, no proper sewers. They call it the squatter period.
Right. A breakdown of order.
Yeah, you see traces at Kalibangan, Amri, Lothal. Maybe Mohenjo-Daro and Harappa saw people just dying out or being killed by occasional marauders, but not some single organized conquest. So it looks like a mix. Internal decline, maybe some external pressures like raids, but not one big violent event.
That makes the transition to the next phase, the arrival of the Aryans, seem less like a sharp break.
It does connect more smoothly. The arrival of these Iranian and Indo-Aryan speakers, well, it's documented in texts like the Avesta and the Veda.
Okay.
But the source is careful to say the exact timing, the details of the migration from Central Asia. Those are still pretty controversial.
Right.
Older historians saw this clear gap, 18th century BC down to maybe the 13th, between the end of Indus and the Aryans showing up.
But newer archaeology is changing that.
It's blurring the lines. You find late Harappan traits continuing in some places into the early Vedic period, and some intrusive elements thought to be early Indo-Aryan are being found earlier than expected. So it's maybe more of a gradual overlap or interaction than a clean break.
And the Vedas are our main window into this Vedic period.
They are. Believed to be divinely inspired, passed down orally incredibly accurately by Brahmin priests. This source calls them a fairly reliable source because of that careful transmission.
And it focuses on the mantra texts.
Yeah, the Rig Veda, Samaveda, Yajurveda, Atharva Veda. The Rig Veda is flagged as the oldest, the most sacred, and probably the best for getting a sense of daily life, their struggles, their ideas, dating roughly 1300 to 1000 BC.
And it wasn't all peaceful coexistence as they settled.
Definitely not. The Rig Veda itself talks about conflict. The source quotes lines about the god Agni driving out the dark-hued races, the Dasyus scattering them for the Arya. But the Aryans also fought fiercely among themselves, tribe against tribe, often over cattle or land. The source mentions specific battles, like one near Harupia where 130 knights were killed.
Oh.
And of course, the famous Battle of 10 Kings from the Rig Veda, a huge clash between two rival Vedic confederations. King Sudasa won, supposedly with Indra's help, against enemies who even tried flooding his camp.
Intense stuff, and iron starts appearing around now, too.
Yes, the source connects mentions of iron in the Rig Veda from the 11th century BC with archaeological finds in the northwest.
Okay.
Earlier texts might have isolated references, but mentions of iron, and specifically using iron axes to clear forests, really increase after 1000 BC.
Right, for expansion.
Exactly.
Yeah.
The source quotes a Rig Veda passage about deities and servants using axes to split wood. Sounds like systematic jungle clearing.
But interestingly,
the source notes that archaeology so far has mostly turned up iron weapons from this early time, not many axes, which might suggest metal was still pretty scarce and maybe prioritized for warfare over farming tools initially.
that makes sense. This period also sees the beginnings of the caste system taking shape.
Yeah, as life became more settled, social divisions hardened. Even in the early Vedic period, you had distinctions. The free members, Vish, the warrior nobility, Kshatriya, the priests, Brahmins.
Okay.
Then, as these semi-nomadic groups settled down, they interacted more with indigenous populations, often bringing them in as laborers or artisans.
And this is where Varna comes in.
Exactly. Varna, which literally means color, became a way to distinguish the Aryans from the subjugated indigenous people, the Dasyas. But soon, the source explains, Varna came to mean caste more broadly, classifying the Aryans themselves, priests, warriors, peasants, and the subjugated people, the Shudras, at the bottom.
And there's a specific text.
A late Rig Veda hymn, X90, the Purusha Sukta. It describes the cosmic sacrifice of the primal being Purusha, from whose body the four Varnas emerge, Brahmin, Kshatriya, Vaishya, and implicitly the Shudra. This hymn became hugely important later for justifying the social hierarchy, especially the Brahmin's top spot.
And the source points out the skills of the indigenous people were actually crucial here.
It does. It cites a late Vedic text showing that the indigenous people were highly skilled artisans, especially in pottery.
But the Aryans looked down on them.
Seems so. The source argues that racial prejudice against the darker-skinned people extended to their trades. And it suggests, maybe controversially, that the Aryans lacked some of these craft skills themselves.
Really?
Yeah, and that this lack might have been a reason for the caste system, a way to maintain social dominance, even while relying on indigenous expertise.
That's a provocative thought.
It is. The source uses the potter's wheel as an example. The text implies Aryans found it already in India, and their apparent prejudice against wheel-made pottery makes it unlikely they invented the famous painted grayware.
So that might have been indigenous originally.
That's the argument presented, that it originated with indigenous potters and was then spread by the Aryans as they moved east. It complicates the picture of technological transfer.
And this connection with indigenous people comes up again with the Mahabharata War.
Yes. The source argues the basic historical reality of the war is hard to doubt. They even mention dice found in painted grayware layers that match descriptions in the epic.
Okay.
And it proposes that the Pandavas' victory over the Kauravas might reflect a successful alliance with indigenous groups.
What's the evidence for that?
Two main points from the epic, according to the source. First, the Pandavas' polyandrous marriage to Draupadi, the daughter of the Panchala king. Polyandry is seen as an indigenous custom, not something Vedic Aryans practiced.
Interesting.
Second, the crucial support they get from the dark-skinned Krishna of Mathura. He's described more like an indigenous hero or god, not an Aryan immigrant figure.
So it was Aryans versus Aryans plus indigenous allies.
That's the interpretation offered. The Kauravas allied with northern Vedic tribes, while the Pandavas allied with indigenous peoples to the east and south. The Pandava victory, then, represents a kind of new synthesis, a fusion based on these alliances.
We also see philosophical shifts happening in the late Vedic period.
Yeah, the source points to some later Rig Veda hymns, like X93, that express a sense of helplessness, sorrow, even doubt about the power of the traditional gods, a different tone from the earlier confidence.
And this leads somewhere.
It seems to lead towards an awareness of a bigger, impersonal, cosmic law, karma. Accountability for your actions affecting this life and future rebirths, samsara.
Core ideas in later Indian thought.
Absolutely. And the source speculates these might have developed partly through interaction with indigenous religious ideas. At the same time, this insecurity might also have fueled reliance on elaborate sacrificial rituals described in the Brahmana texts, making the Brahmin priests even more indispensable.
And all this is happening alongside that major expansion eastward into the Gangetic Plains.
Yes, the source calls this the most important movement of the era. It quotes a text saying, "The people move from the west to the east and conquer land."
And land here means?
Specifically fields fit for cultivation. It's about expanding the agricultural base.
Right.
There's a vivid description in the Shatapatha Brahmana about the founding of Videha, northeast of modern Patna. Prince Videgamatthava is guided eastward by the fire god Agni until they stop at the Satanira River, the Gandak.
Wow.
The source presents this text as really instructive, showing late Vedic civilization literally burning its way east, clearing land and establishing new settlements.
So out of all this ferment expansion, new social structures, philosophical shifts, We get the rise of these larger states, the Mahajanapadas.
Exactly. Around the 7th, 6th centuries BC, the source tells us 16 of these great states emerged.
Centered where mainly?
The hub was really the Ganga-Yamuna Doab, that fertile region between the rivers and the area just east of it. Key names the source lists are Magadha, Kosala, Vatsa, Kurupanchala, Anga, Avanti, Chetya.
How did they actually form? Did they just grow out of the older tribes?
It's a bit speculative, the source admits. The old tribes were probably too small. They were likely confederations, maybe several tribes banding together.
Any clues in how they were structured?
Some evidence, like certain states having two capitals, Hastinapura and Indraprastha for the Kurus, Kampila and Ahichachar for the Panchalas, might suggest a fusion of groups. Their internal structure might have been similar to later medieval Hindu kingdoms. Direct royal power in a core area, but a periphery where you had autonomous princes or even rivals holding sway. Borders were often natural features, like rivers. The king's authority depended partly on the loyalty of border tribes.
And this era also sees these major religious and philosophical reform movements taking off.
Right. Buddhism, the source calls it a spiritual expression of this new Gangetic civilization. A reaction, perhaps, against that Brahmin-Kshatriya dominance of the late Vedic age.
And Gautama Buddha
is presented as the first really solid historical figure we can identify. The source does mention the ongoing debate about his death date, the traditional 544 BC, the more common scholarly date of 483 BC, or even a century later, which some recent research, backed by archaeological evidence on urbanization, seems to support.
And Jainism, too.
Yes, Mahavira, the founder of Jainism, is mentioned as probably a younger contemporary of the Buddha.
Right.
Jainism has had this unbroken tradition in India, especially strong among merchant communities in Western India. The source even notes Gandhi's rigorous ethics were likely influenced by Jainism, given his upbringing in a Gujarati Banya family.
Now, amidst all this, the source highlights Magadha's meteoric rise. It becomes the first really big empire.
Yeah, its rise under kings Bimbisara and Ajatashatru within just a couple of generations is called an enigma.
Why enigmatic?
Because this huge state emerged quite suddenly and seemingly at the periphery of the main Gangetic civilization without a long, slow buildup. It wasn't just another kingdom getting bigger, it represented a new scale of political organization.
So where did that model come from?
Well, the source mentions one theory diffusion from Western Asia, maybe knowledge of Persian administration spreading east. But it also stresses the need to look within India's own history in the 7th and 6th centuries BC for the answers.
This leads us into the Mauryan Empire, the really famous one.
Right, Chandragupta Maurya. Not much is known about his background, but the source suggests he might have gotten his start fighting against Alexander the Great's garrisons left behind in the northwest.
How he actually got to Magadha and took power is a bit hazy.
It's obscure, yeah. But Indian traditions give a lot of credit to his advisor, the Brahmin Kautilya, traditionally seen as the author of the Arthashastra.
And we get an outside perspective from Megasthenes.
Ah, yes. The Greek ambassador from Seleucus at Chandragupta's court in Pataliputra. His writings, though lost, were quoted by later classical authors and massively boosted European knowledge of India.
What did he focus on?
His description of a capital, Pataliputra, was famous, and also his account of Indian society having 7 distinct strata, or classes.
How did he break that down?
He listed philosophers Brahmins first, then agriculturists, and he made this interesting comment, quoted in the source, that farmers were exempt from military service and other state duties, they just paid rent. And he adds, in India, all land belongs to the king. Gives you a fascinating glimpse of the social and land structure as seen by an outsider.
But for the inside view, we have the Arthashastra.
Exactly. Attributed mainly to Kautilya, around 300 BC, though the source notes parts are probably later additions, maybe up to AD 300.
And it paints a picture of?
A very coherent picture of a centrally administered empire, with the state aiming to control pretty much all aspects of public life and the economy.
What was the core idea driving it?
The prosperity artha of both the king and the country, they were seen as intertwined.
The source mentions Kautilya's circle of states idea. That sounds intriguing.
It is. It's called the mandala theory. Basically, the king who's striving for victory, the Vijigishu, is at the center.
Okay.
His immediate neighbor is the natural enemy, the Ari. But the neighbor beyond the enemy is the natural friend, the Mitra.
Ah, the enemy of my enemy.
Exactly. And this pattern repeats outwards in concentric circles. But it's not totally rigid. There are other players, The powerful middle king, Madhyama, who could be neutral or swing the balance, and the great outsider, Udashina, this powerful but distant ruler whose actions are unpredictable and need watching.
So it's a whole system for thinking about foreign policy.
A theoretical framework for interstate relations, yeah, based on geography and power dynamics.
Kautilya also thought about how the state should treat its own people, right? Not just about power projection.
Crucially, yes. The source really emphasizes this. Kautilya recognized that if you taxed people too heavily or used too much forced labor,
They just leave.
they'd flee to the enemy. It was counterproductive. So the king had to consider the welfare and contentment of his subjects.
But not out of pure altruism.
Not necessarily. It was framed as a necessary political requirement for the king's own success and the stability of the state. State interest wasn't just raw power, it included a kind of calculated welfare.
That's a really important nuance. Then the source moves on to Ashoka.
Right. Ashoka takes the throne in 268 BC. The source notes the empire already stretched down to Karnataka by then.
So Ashoka didn't conquer the south.
Probably not all of it. It suggests either Chandragupta himself or his son Bindusara had already pushed south. There are Jaina texts about Chandragupta dying by fasting in Karnataka, which might support the idea he started the southern expansion.
Ashoka's fame, of course, comes largely from the Kalinga War and his policy of Dhamma.
Yes, the source mentions his famous repentance after the brutality of the Kalinga campaign, and his edicts are key evidence for his Dhamma policy.
Where were these edicts found?
Carved into rocks, often in frontier regions. The source mentions 8 complete versions and 2 fragments discovered, including that fascinating Greek-Aramaic bilingual one in Kandahar.
What kind of things did they command?
Things like reducing meat consumption at the royal court, prohibiting certain types of immoral public gatherings, and expressing goodwill towards neighbors, the Cholas, the Pandyas down south, even rulers far to the west like Antiochus II.
So a mix of moral instruction and foreign policy.
And administration, too. Officers called Dhamma Mahamadas were appointed and ordered to tour the empire regularly to ensure this right conduct was being followed.
How was such a huge empire actually managed? What was the structure?
The source describes a 5-part division. You had the central part, Magadha, and the old heartlands of the Mahajanapadas under direct imperial administration. This probably followed the kind of models described by Megasthenes and Kautilya.
Right.
Then there were 4 large outer provinces, each governed by a prince, titled Kumara or Aryaputra, acting as a viceroy.
Where were these based?
Taxila in the northwest, Tasali in the east, covering the newly conquered Kalinga, Ujjain in the west, and Suvarnagiri, Golden Mountain, in the south.
And maybe a 5th.
There's a mention of a new inscription found near Ujjain referring to a Kumara, which might hint at a 5th province, or maybe it just confirms the western viceroyalty's location. The structure seems quite organized.
But after the Mauryas, the source points to a significant shift.
Yeah, the empire fragments. There's a short-lived Kanva dynasty, but Magadha declines back to being just a regional power.
And the focus moves.
The political center of gravity shifts northwest, where various foreign dynasties start to contend for power.
And the south becomes more important.
Exactly. The defeat of the last Kanva king by a king from the Shatavahana dynasty based in the Deccan around 28 BC, that really signals the end of Magadha's long dominance and the rise of central and southern India. That trend continues for centuries.
Who were these foreign dynasties up in the northwest?
The source first mentions the Indo-Greeks. These were successors of the Greco-Bactrian kingdom founded by Euthydemus. They ruled large areas of northwest India and Afghanistan.
How much do we know about them?
Not a huge amount, actually. There were about 40 kings, known mainly from their coins, which are often quite beautiful. Their history, especially in the 1st century BC, is pretty poorly recorded. Only a couple of inscriptions found in India give us info, plus some scattered references in Indian literature to the Yavanas, Greeks, and a few European sources.
What was their significance?
The source calls them representatives of Hellenic policy, who managed to survive the defeat of their Bactrian base by Parthians for over a century, holding out in these eastern outposts. Their eventual withdrawal wasn't just due to Indian resistance, like from Pushyamitra Shunga,
No.
but also internal problems and pressure from further east.
Like the revolt back in Bactria led by Eucrates.
Exactly. That civil war drew Demetrios, one of the main Indo-Greek kings, back west where he was killed. Eucrates took over much of the western part, though another king, Menander, held on further east in India.
And then Eucrates faced pressure.
Yeah, from the Parthians, and then finally his kingdom was overrun by the Shakas, this Central Asian tribal group, somewhere between 141 and 128 BC.
But Indo-Greek rule didn't just vanish.
No, it seems it continued in parts of northwest India for a while longer. The source describes this later phase as a period of great splendor, suggesting they maintained a significant cultural presence.
After the Shakas came the Kushanas.
Right, another major Central Asian power. They controlled a huge area, Central Asia, Afghanistan, until the early 3rd century AD.
What happened to them?
They were eventually defeated by Ardashir, the founder of the Sassanid Persian Empire. Local Kushana princes held on longer in places like the Kabul Valley, and some rulers seem to have survived in northwest India too.
How do we know that?
The source points to that Allahabad inscription again, the one detailing Samudragupta's conquests around AD 335-375. It lists the Daivaputras Shahi Shahanu Shahis among the rulers who acknowledged Samudragupta's power.
And that title?
Son of Heaven, King of Kings. That sounds very much like the Kushana royal titles. It suggests successors of Kanishka, the most famous Kushana king, were still around, even if diminished, preserving a memory of Kushana glory.
The source then focuses on the Gupta Empire as the last great empire of antiquity in India.
Yes, picking up with Samudragupta again. His campaigns, detailed in that Allahabad inscription, show a complex approach to empire building.
Not just conquest.
No. He applied different policies depending on the region. Some kingdoms, especially in the northern heartland, he seems to have extinguished and annexed directly.
But others?
Others, like the 12 kings mentioned in the Dakshinapatha, the south, he apparently defeated, but then released and reinstated, possibly in return for tribute or acknowledging his supremacy. He also claimed control over forest rulers, frontier kingdoms, and tribal republics on the edges.
So how did the Guptas manage this large and varied territory? What was the structure?
The source describes a kind of layered system. There was a core region, Aryavarta, under direct imperial rule.
Okay.
Beyond that, you had these border kings who paid tribute and acknowledged Gupta power. But the source emphasizes they were not obliged to join the Gupta army. It calls them tributary princes rather than real vassals.
A key distinction.
It is. It suggests a looser form of control compared to, say, European feudalism. These figures later evolve into the Samantas of the medieval period, who do become more like vassals, rising high at court. And then there were areas with unsubdued tribes beyond that. Some historians, the source notes, even argue for a multi-centered structure for the Gupta Empire, not a purely unitary one.
Why? Because powerful regional centers started emerging within the empire itself, like Punavardhana in Bengal or Avanti Ujjain in the west.
Exactly. These areas developed their own importance and administrative structures, even under the Gupta umbrella. The source suggests this kind of foreshadowed the political landscape of the medieval period, with its balance of power between strong regional kingdoms.
Chandragupta II is the next major Gupta ruler highlighted.
Yes, Samudragupta's successor. His key achievement, according to the source, was finally defeating the Shakas who had ruled western India for centuries. This happened between 397 and 409 AD.
How they did that so precisely?
Coin evidence, primarily. You have Shaka coins dated to 397, and then by 409 you have Chandragupta II issuing his own silver coins that clearly copy the Shaka pattern, but crucially replace the Shaka Buddhist symbol with the Gupta symbol Vishnu's eagle, Garuda.
Clever use of coinage. He also used marriage alliances, didn't he?
He did, very strategically. He married his daughter, Prabhavata Gupta, to Rudrasena II, the ruler of the Vakataka dynasty in central India.
Why were the Vakatakas important?
They were a major power that had risen after the Shatavahanas, effectively blocking Gupta expansion southwards beyond the Vindhya Mountains. Samudragupta had carefully avoided their territory, so this marriage alliance secured Chandragupta II's southern flank. Smart politics.
And the Gupta period overall saw increased trade and economic growth.
Yes, having direct access to ports on both the east and west coasts was key. The source points to the sheer number of gold coins issued as evidence of this prosperity.
Were the Indian designs?
Initially, they copied the Roman dinara, but later, the way it was adjusted to Indian standards. These coins weren't just currency, they were also propaganda, with idealized, godlike portraits of the rulers.
And silver coins, too.
Chandragupta II introduced silver coins, following that Shaka tradition he took over in the West, and these spread throughout the empire. Copper coins and even shells were used for smaller local transactions.
But eventually decline set in, and the Huns arrived on the scene.
Yes, in the later phase of the Gupta Empire, northwestern India became part of a large Central Asian empire established by the Huns, or Hunas, as they're often called in Indian sources.
How much do we know about their rule?
Not a huge amount. There are sources like the Kashmir Chronicle, which mentions a Hun ruler named Toramana potentially campaigning south, though the source seems doubtful about that. We also get glimpses from a Chinese ambassador, a Greek seafarer writing about trade, and later the Chinese pilgrim Han Zhang. They all paint a picture of cruelty associated with Hun rule.
Was it long-lasting?
No, their direct rule in India seems to have been relatively short-lived. They were defeated by a local Indian ruler named Yashodharman around 528 AD, and their wider Central Asian empire was ultimately broken by the Turks in the mid-6th century.
While all this is happening up north, the source takes us back down south to the Sangam age.
Right. The first few centuries AD, this period saw the flourishing of the three traditional Tamil powers, the Cheras, the Cholas, and the Pandyas. They were known even back in Ashoka's time. He mentions them in his edicts.
What's the main source for this period?
Sangam literature, a large body of Tamil poetry. It gives us names and stories, mentions figures like the Chera king Sengutuvan campaigning northwards, and the Chola king Karakala, who's associated with building dikes on the Kaveri River and possibly founding Kanchipuram. Though Karakala's expansion apparently alienated people, forcing him to make concessions later.
Then there's this period called the Calabra Interregnum. Sounds mysterious.
It is a bit murky. The source describes it as a period after the Sangam age, starting with an invasion by these Calabras, and ending only with the rise of the Plava dynasty in the 6th century AD.
Where did the Calabras come from?
Their origins are unknown. Medieval Tamil texts, written later, portray them very negatively as bad kings who disrupted the traditional social order, destroyed established dynasties, and canceled land grants previously given to Brahmins.
But maybe that's not the whole story.
Possibly not. Buddhist literature offers a different perspective. It mentions a Calabra king named Chutavikanta, who apparently patronized Buddhist monasteries and poets, and was even quoted approvingly later on.
So who were they really?
The source suggests they were likely a mountain tribe, maybe followers of Buddhism or Jainism who descended onto the fertile lowlands. It contrasts them with a later group, the Hoysalas, who also started as outsiders but, once established, became patrons of Orthodox Hinduism. It highlights how historical memory can be shaped by who's writing it.
And throughout this early period, South India's ports were vital for trade, weren't they?
Absolutely crucial. The source uses the Periplus Maris Erythrae, a Greek maritime guide from around 8100, as key evidence for just how extensive this trade was.
What kind of trade?
South Indian ports acted as major hubs, as entrepôts. Goods came in from China silk especially, from North India oil, from Southeast Asia, precious stones, spices. They were connecting different parts of the world.
Any specific coasts or ports mentioned?
Yes, the Coromandel coast, the east coast, apparently eclipsed the Malabar coast on the west for trade heading east. Specific ports named include Kamara, perhaps near modern Karakal, Paducah, likely Pondicherry, and Supatama.
And the source makes an interesting connection.
Yeah, it notes that these very same locations, Pondicherry, Karakal, Supatama, centuries later became sites for European trading factories, history echoing itself.
So moving on, the source marks the period from the decline of the Guptas to the rise of the Mughals as early medieval India, and it notes a shift.
Right. It makes the point that up until about 500 AD, the main historical narrative we have is predominantly North Indian.
But this medieval millennium changes that.
Exactly. This period, roughly 500 to 1500 AD, was often depicted in older histories as just fragmented, maybe even a time of cultural decline. It got less attention than the great ancient empires.
But recent research sees it differently.
Yes, the source emphasizes that recent scholarship shows this was actually a really important period. You have these major regional kingdoms constantly vying for supremacy, and they made huge contributions to Indian history overall. Central and South India become just as important as the North during this time.
And the source connects this apparent absence of political unity to something positive.
It does. It presents it as a demonstration of that classic theme in Indian history, unity and diversity.
How so?
The argument is that because there wasn't one single dominant empire for much of this period, different regions were able to develop their own distinct cultures, languages, scripts, art styles, literature. They forged their own identities while still remaining interconnected through trade, religion, and shared cultural ideas.
King Harsha of Kannauj is presented as sort of standing at the threshold of this new medieval era.
Yeah, Harsha ruled 606-647 AD. He managed to pull together an empire that rivaled the Guptas in size, stretching from the Punjab down to northern Orissa.
A throwback to the old imperial model.
In a way, his court fostered high classical Sanskrit culture, and he patronized both Hindu and Buddhist institutions. It looked like a revival of Gupta glory. The source mentions the famous writer Bana, who composed a biography of Harsha, but Harsha's empire didn't last long after him. The real pattern of the medieval era was these four major regional power blocks: North, East, Central, the Deccan Plateau, and the South.
And in the south, we see the return of familiar names. Cholas, Pandyas.
That's right. The Pallavas, based at Kanchipuram, were the leading power in the south, from roughly the 6th to the 9th centuries.
Okay.
After they declined, the Cholas, with their capital at Thanjavur, rose to prominence and really dominated the south until the mid-13th century. They built a massive empire, even projecting power overseas into Southeast Asia.
And then the Pandyas.
The Pandyas, based in Madurai, had a brief period as the premier southern power after the Cholas faded, but they eventually succumbed to the invasions from the Delhi Sultanate in the early 14th century.
Okay, moving east. The source highlights the Pala dynasty.
Yes, the palace ruled a large kingdom based in Bengal and Bihar for several centuries. Their founder, Gopala, is interesting because he wasn't from an established royal lineage.
How did he come to power then?
There's a legend mentioned in the source that he was actually elected by the people, or maybe by the leading chiefs, to put an end to a period of chaos and anarchy.
Anarchy described as
the state of the fishes, or Matsyana in Sanskrit. The idea that in the absence of a ruler, the big fish just devour the small fish. Might makes right.
That concept appears elsewhere.
Yes, the source notes this idea of anarchy requiring a ruler is common in old Indian political thought. It even anticipates Hobbes's ideas about a rational contract between the ruler and the ruled to establish order.
Going back to the Pallavas in the south, they left a significant cultural legacy, didn't they? Particularly in art and architecture.
Immense. King Mahendravarman, an early Pallava ruler, was a poet himself, writing Sanskrit plays, and he commissioned the first great Hindu cave temples in the south. He's said to have converted from Jainism to Shivaism.
And his successors.
Narasimhavarman, also known as Mahamala, great wrestler, is linked to the port town of Mahabalipuram and its incredible rock-cut temples, those famous rathas carved from single rocks, and the huge relief carving known as the Descent of the Ganga, or Arjuna's Penance.
Truly spectacular works.
And then Narasimhavarman II, ruling around 680-720, is called the greatest builder of the dynasty. He's credited with the Shore Temple at Mahabalipuram and the magnificent Kalasanath Temple in the capital, Kanchipuram.
What was their distinct style?
The source notes they really perfected the South Indian temple tower, the Vimana, that characteristic steep pyramid shape, and they transmitted this architectural style across the Bay of Bengal to Southeast Asia, particularly influencing temple architecture in places like Java. The source also includes this absolutely fantastic quote about medieval Indian merchants. It's really vivid.
Yes, I remember that. It talks about them traveling by land and water across continents, lifting this incredible range of goods.
Elephants, horses, jewels, sapphires, moonstones, pearls, diamonds, perfumes, medicines, spices, cardamom, cloves, sandalwood, camphor. It's an amazing list.
But it's more than just a list, isn't it?
Oh, much more. It describes how these merchants fill the emperor's treasury, partly by preventing customs evasion, and how they give generous gifts to learned men.
And the language used to describe the emperor's court.
It's incredible. It uses these rich metaphors, portraying the court and the king's attendants as gods and celestial bodies. Listen to this part. With their white umbrellas raised aloft as their canopy, the mighty ocean serving as their moat, Indra himself as their handguard, the sun and moon as their backers, the 33 gods as the spectators.
Wow. That's poetic.
Isn't it? It gives you such a powerful sense of the grandeur, the almost cosmic significance associated with royal power, and how that power was visibly linked to the immense wealth generated by this far-flung trade.
The source then digs into the structure of these medieval Hindu kingdoms, focusing on the roles of Brahmins and temples in maintaining power.
Yeah, it argues that despite the regional diversity, some basic structural similarities emerged in the post-Gupta era. The figure of the Maharaja, the great king, became a distinct cultural type.
How did this model spread?
Through imitation, weaker rulers copying stronger ones, and also crucially through the agency of Brahmins, who often served as royal advisors, priests, and administrators, carrying these ideas and practices across different kingdoms.
And Brahmins played a key role in legitimizing the king's rule.
A very important role, yes. The source explains how land grants to Brahmins were used strategically.
How so? More than just religious piety.
Definitely. In the Gupta period, grants were often given in uncultivated areas, so Brahmins acted as pioneers, spreading settled agriculture and Hindu culture into new regions. But from the 10th century onwards, the nature of the grants shifted, according to the source. Kings started granting the revenue of existing villages, sometimes villages located within the territories of their samantas, those tributary princes we mentioned.
Ah, so the king is giving away revenue that technically belonged to his subordinate.
Exactly. It was done at the samanta's expense. The Brahmin recipient would naturally feel loyal to the king who gave the grant, not the local samanta, so the king gained a loyal follower deep within his subordinate's territory.
Clever. Could the samanta object?
Not easily, because granting land to Brahmins was such a deeply ingrained tradition, essential for the king's religious merit, punya. Objecting would be religiously and politically difficult.
And the scale of these grants changed too.
Yes, grants shifted from often being to single Brahmin families to sometimes supporting large numbers. The source gives an example of a Gahadavala ruler near Varanasi granting the revenue from over 100 villages to support 500 Brahmins. Big numbers. And this practice intensified just as the power of these samantas themselves was growing, a phenomenon called samantization. So, land grants were one way kings tried to counterbalance the rising power of their own feudatories.
And temples were another tool in this balancing act.
A major one. Building huge royal temples like the spectacular Brihadiswar temple built by the Chola king Rajaraja I at his capital Thanjavur served multiple purposes.
More than just devotion.
Oh, yes. These temples became massive institutions, almost parallel centers of power loyal to the king. They received enormous land grants themselves, both near the capital and in distant areas, sometimes again within Samanta territories.
How large were these temple complexes?
Huge. Hundreds of Brahmins, temple servants, dancers, musicians were attached. The inscriptions at Thanjavur even detail exactly which villages were responsible for supplying rice to the temple guards.
Incredible detail.
And importantly, the Samantarajas and other high officials were often required to perform specific services or make donations to the royal temple, reinforcing their subordination to the king. The king's own personal priest, the Rajguru, was often also the head priest of the royal temple and managed its vast properties. It tied religious authority, economic power, and political loyalty together.
Fascinating system.
Yeah.
Shifting gears slightly, the source talks about the rise of bhakti movements around this time.
Yes, emerging strongly in South India from around the 6th century onwards, bhakti represented a different kind of religious feeling.
How so? A reaction against something?
In part, yeah. The source presents it as a reaction against the complex ritualism dominated by Brahmins, the rigidities of the caste hierarchy, and the emphasis on Sanskrit as the sacred language.
So what did bhakti emphasize instead?
Intense, ecstatic, personal devotion bhakti to a specific god, usually Vishnu or Shiva or forms of the goddess.
Who were the key figures?
The early saints were poets, the Alvars who worshipped Vishnu, and the Nayanars who worshipped Shiva. Many came from non-Brahmin backgrounds. They wandered the countryside, singing devotional hymns in the local language, Tamil.
And they established holy places.
Yes, they identified or sanctified specific locations, kshatras associated with the gods' legends or their own mystical experiences. This started mainly in Tamil Nadu, but the movement gradually spread northwards, and these holy places often became sites for the construction of new public temples, accessible to wider communities.
This idea of gods having specific locations on Earth seems different from the earlier Vedic traditions.
It is. The source points out that the Vedic gods didn't really have fixed abodes on Earth. They were invoked through sacrifice wherever the ritual took place.
Right.
But the Bhakti gods, like Vishnu and Shiva, were seen as manifesting both in heaven and on Earth. A bhakta, a devotee, might experience the god's presence in a particular tree, a stone, a river, or a hermit's cave.
And temple legends reflect this.
Exactly. The Stala Mahatmyas, the texts glorifying specific temples, often refer back to these humble local origins, emphasizing the unique sanctity of that particular place. The statues within the temples, the archer, are seen not just as symbols, but as actual incarnations, avatara, tangible forms of the divine.
The source quotes Manikava Sagar.
Yes, that beautiful line expressing this intimacy, "He has come to me who is of no use." It captures that sense of the divine becoming accessible, present in a tangible, personal way, even for someone feeling lowly or unworthy. Bhakti also had a political dimension, contributing to what the source calls the royalization of gods.
Royalization of gods, what does that mean exactly?
It's kind of the flip side of the deification of kings. Instead of just kings becoming godlike, in medieval India, you see gods associated with particular regions or dynasties becoming increasingly royal in their character and cult.
How did that work?
Their worship was often formalized, Sanskritized, brought into line with pan-Indian traditions, but it usually kept traces of its local, sometimes tribal origins. These local elements enriched regional culture and literature.
And how did this connect to the king?
Like great earthly kings, these major regional gods were depicted as having their own courts, incorporating lesser, sub-regional deities who might be the family gods of the king's samantas. These, in turn, would preside over local village gods. It created a kind of divine hierarchy mirroring the political one.
And this helped the king's legitimacy.
The source argues yes. The more grand and royal the cult of the main territorial god became, the more legitimate the king's claim to rule that territory on behalf of that god. The king became the deity's temporal representative. Bhakti's emphasis on devotion fostered loyalty to both the god and the god's earthly embodiment, the king.
Very intertwined. The source then moves to philosophical developments, especially around the start of the second millennium, maybe shifting away from the pure emotionalism of early bhakti.
Yeah, after that wave of intense devotionalism, you get a new wave of really sophisticated philosophical speculation. A key debate was how to reconcile the idea of an impersonal cosmic law, like karma, with the idea of an all-powerful personal god worshipped in bhakti.
How was that resolved?
Shankara, the great philosopher of Advaita Vedanta, offered a hugely influential synthesis. His monism, the idea of non-duality, saw the ultimate reality, Brahman, as a universal essence that encompasses both impersonal law and divine manifestation. This allowed abstract philosophy and diverse popular faiths to coexist peacefully.
But not everyone agreed with Shankara, particularly the Bhaktas.
Right. Shankara's view that the perceived world, including the gods worshipped by Bhaktas, was ultimately an illusion, Maya, was difficult for many devotees to accept. For them, the world was a real manifestation of the divine, and the objects of their worship were intensely real and grace-giving.
So this led to different philosophical schools developing.
Yes, medieval philosophy became more overtly sectarian. Shaivite philosophers were often more sympathetic to Shankara's ideas, while Vaishnavites tended to emphasize the reality of the world and the distinctness of God and the soul.
The source highlights Ramanuja as a key figure here.
Absolutely. Ramanuja, active around 1100 AD in Tamil Nadu, was probably the most important Vaishnavite philosopher challenging Shankara.
What was his system?
He combined elements of Shankara's Advaita framework with the theology of the Vaishnava Pancharatra tradition, which sees Vishnu as the foundation of the universe. His philosophy is called Vishishtadvaita, or qualified monism.
Qualified monism. How does that work?
For Ramanuja, God, Vishnu, is indeed all-encompassing and eternal, but he is not undifferentiated. The individual souls, sit, and matter, asit, are also real. They are considered divine qualities or attributes of God. Souls are eternally one with God in essence, yet also eternally distinct as individual entities.
And how is salvation achieved in this view?
Through a combination of leading a virtuous life, gaining knowledge of this differentiation between God's soul and matter, and ultimately through loving devotion, bhakti, and receiving God's grace, it provided a philosophical basis for devotional worship that affirmed the reality of the worshipped deity.
Beyond philosophy, the source also reminds us of medieval India's continued cultural influence outwards, especially towards Southeast Asia.
Yes, particularly in the later medieval period. Scholars from the great Buddhist university at Nalanda and the artistic styles developed under the Pala dynasty in Bihar and Bengal, who were the last major Indian dynasty to patronize Buddhism, had a significant impact.
Where specifically?
Mahayana Buddhism, as practiced under the Palas, was strong at the court of the Shilinja dynasty in Java. The source mentions a Bengali monk even became the Raj Guru, the royal preceptor, there and consecrated an important statue. There was constant contact between Bengal, eastern Bihar, Orissa, and Southeast Asia. Art in the region often reflected this East Indian style, especially in how figures were arranged. And it wasn't just Hinduism and Buddhism. Indian Sufism also played a role in spreading Islam to Indonesia later on.
Through trade connections.
Seems likely. The oldest Muslim tombstones found there suggest influence from Western India, particularly Gujarat, whose merchants were heavily involved in the spice trade. Tamil Muslim traders from the Coromandel coast were also active. The source mentions they even staged a coup in Malacca in 1445.
So a long period of intense interaction.
A whole millennium, really. And it effectively ended for both India and Southeast Asia around the early 16th century, when the era of European maritime dominance began. Albuquerque's capture of Malacca in 1511 is often seen as a key marker for that shift.
Moving into the later medieval period within India, the source discusses the impact of Mahmud of Ghaznī's raids.
Yes, Mahmud's repeated invasions between 1000 and 1027 had a profound and lasting impact on North India.
Why was North India so vulnerable at that time?
The source attributes his military success partly to the political situation. That earlier triangular contest for power between the northern Gurjara Pratiharas, the eastern palace, and the central Rashtrakutas had weakened the Pratiharas, who had previously acted as a bulwark against invaders from the northwest.
And no one stepped into that vacuum?
No single dominant power emerged immediately in the north capable of mounting a unified defense against Mahmud. And the greatest Indian power at that time, the Cholas in the south, were geographically remote and seemingly barely took notice of the raids happening far to the north.
The source then moves on to the Delhi Sultanate, which was established later, and highlights one particular ruler, Alauddin Khilji.
Yes, Alauddin's reign is fascinating. His administrative and economic reforms, described by the chronicler Barani in his Tarikh-i-Firoz Shahi, are called fascinating accounts of pre-modern administrative reforms.
Why so significant?
The source presents them as perhaps the only known systematic attempt by a medieval Indian ruler to establish a highly centralized administration and, crucially, to interfere directly with market forces controlling prices, supply chains, trying to manage the entire economy from the center.
And the source draws a parallel with an earlier text.
Yes, quite strikingly, it notes similarities between Alauddin's policies and the prescriptions found in Kautilya's Arthashastra, written over 1,000 years earlier.
Did he know the Arthashastra?
The source suggests he might have, and perhaps share the fundamental view that the interest of the state, raison d'etat, was the supreme, perhaps only norm for a ruler.
Is there a quote illustrating this?
Yes, the source quotes Alauddin saying something like, "He issues orders that he considers for the good of the state and for the benefit of the people, whether or not he knows if they are strictly lawful or unlawful according to Islamic injunctions. State necessity trumped religious law if they clashed."
What about his policies towards his Hindu subjects, often portrayed very negatively?
The source addresses this directly and offers a more nuanced view. It acknowledges the harshness and quotes the idea found in both Alauddin's thinking and seemingly in a Hindu text, likely referring back to the Arthashastra or similar statecraft manuals, that the Hindus will never become submissive till they are reduced to poverty.
So, deliberate impoverishment.
That seems to have been the policy goal: leave them just enough corn, milk, and curds to survive, as Alauddin reportedly said, but prevent them from accumulating wealth or property that could fund rebellion. While he did save North India from devastating Mongol invasions, Hindus understandably disliked him for this intentional oppression.
But the source adds some caveats.
Yes. It notes he was rather impartial in his oppression. He was equally harsh, if not harsher, toward his own Muslim courtiers and officials if they stepped out of line. And according to the chronicler Barani, poor rural Hindus were explicitly exempted from some of the harshest economic measures.
What about the high tax rate, 50%?
The complaint that his 50% land revenue demand was unprecedentedly high compared to previous Hindu rulers is challenged by the source. It argues that while Hindu law texts like Manu might prescribe a nominal 16th share, actual collections by Hindu rulers often involved numerous additional taxes, cesses, and exactions that could amount to much more.
So Alauddin was simplifying things.
In a way. He prohibited all those additional levies, implemented a direct assessment system, and fixed the demand at a flat 50%. While high, it was arguably more predictable and potentially less arbitrary than the previous system. So it's presented as more complex than simple religious persecution. It was about state control and revenue maximization, applied somewhat ruthlessly to all groups who pose a potential threat.
Okay, shifting south again, the source introduces the Vijayanagara Empire.
Founded in 1346, rising in opposition to the sultanates. The source mentions that after its founding Saluva dynasty, there was a period of usurpations and constant crisis.
How did it survive then?
Partly because its main rivals, the Bahmani Sultanate to its north and the Gajapati Kingdom in Orissa, were also facing their own internal troubles and couldn't press their advantage consistently.
But then a major figure emerges, Krishnadeva.
Yes, Krishnadeva, who reigned from 1509 to 1529, belonged to the Tuluva dynasty. He's portrayed as ending the internal crisis and restoring Vijayanagara's power and glory. He was a renowned warrior, but also a very astute politician.
Any examples of his political skill?
The source highlights his victory over the combined forces of the Bahmani Sultan Muhammad Shah and other Deccan sultans. After winning the battle and capturing the wounded sultan...
He didn't execute him.
No, he actually reinstated him on his throne. A very deliberate move to keep the Deccan sultanates divided and prevent them from uniting against Vijayanagara again.
Clever. Did it earn him any special recognition?
It did. He earned the Sanskrit title Yavana Raja Stapana Akarya, which means something like Master of the Foundation of the Sultanate, acknowledging his power even over the Muslim rulers.
Did he have other campaigns?
Yes. He also campaigned successfully against the Gajapati ruler of Orissa, eventually securing peace through a marriage alliance, receiving the Gajapati's daughter in marriage. This kept the Eastern Front quiet for his lifetime, although it didn't save Orissa from later troubles.
The source then shifts focus decisively northwards again to the arrival of the Mughals, starting with Babur.
Babu, the founder of the dynasty. His unique contribution to Indian warfare, according to the source, wasn't just introducing firearms, but his genius in combining the muskets and artillery with the traditional Central Asian cavalry tactics he had learned from fighting the Uzbeks.
That combination was key.
Yes. The source finds it surprising because firearms were relatively new, even to Babur himself. He was primarily an archer, but he grasped how to integrate these new weapons seamlessly into his battle plans.
Better than later generals.
Apparently so. The source suggests some later Mughal generals, stuck in a traditional cavalry mindset, lost touch with the effective use of their own artillery and infantry. Babur understood the synergy right from the start. The siege of Bayar in 1519 is mentioned as an early example. The defenders were initially amused by the noise of the muskets until they saw their deadly effect.
Jumping much later in the Mughal period, the source looks at Aurangzeb's reign, particularly his later years and the conquests in the south.
Yes, after finally conquering the last independent Deccan sultanates, Bijapur and Golconda, Aurangzeb faced the challenge of integrating their ruling elites into the Mughal system.
How did he try to do that?
Primarily through the Mansabdari system, granting them high ranks, mansabs, within the Mughal nobility, which came with military obligations and land revenue assignments. Juggers.
Did this change the composition of the Mughal elite?
Significantly. The source provides comparative figures for the number of high-ranking officers, those holding ranks from 2,000 up to 7,000, and the very top rank of 7,000 between the first 2 decades and the last 3 decades of Aurangzeb's long reign.
And what do the figures show?
A decisive structural change. There's a very significant increase in the proportion of high-ranking mansabdars who came from the Deccan, and a corresponding decrease in those from families with long-standing imperial service. It reflects Aurangzeb's political necessity and eagerness to accommodate the powerful Deccan nobility to stabilize his rule there.
But his reign was also marked by numerous revolts, wasn't it?
Yes, increasingly so, especially in the later years. The source mentions his own son, Prince Akbar, challenging him. Akbar fled south and joined forces with Shivaji's son, Sambhaji, hoping to rally Rajput and Maratha support to restore a more tolerant policy, a plan the source calls a futile dream.
What happened to them?
Aurangzeb eventually defeated Akbar, who fled to Persia. Sambhaji was captured and brutally tortured to death. Aurangzeb then formally annexed Golconda and Bijapur and spent the last decades of his life campaigning relentlessly in the Deccan, making Aurangabad his effective capital. But the cost was enormous. The constant warfare and the increasing revenue demands needed to fund it became extremely oppressive, according to the source. This fueled widespread revolts.
Who led these revolts?
Often local landlords, the zamindars, using their own retainers and mobilizing the peasantry. What started as perhaps isolated protests evolved into broader movements based on shared identity kinship among the Jats, religion among the Sikhs, or a growing sense of quasi-national feeling among the Marathas, who became the most significant challenge to Mughal authority.
This period of Mughal decline coincides with the arrival and growing influence of European powers. The source starts with the Portuguese.
Yes, the Portuguese arrived at the very beginning of the 16th century and managed to seize control of key points in the Indian Ocean trade network with remarkable speed.
What gave them the edge?
The source points to their experience gained during Atlantic exploration, their advanced skills in navigation, shipbuilding, and naval gunnery. Also, a sense of desperation. Their home country was small, relatively poor, suffering epidemics and shortages. The quest for wealth abroad was intense, almost desperate.
But they had limitations.
Definitely. The source stresses that tiny Portugal was a slender base for a global empire. Their dominance depended heavily on specific circumstances in the Indian Ocean that they exploited but couldn't ultimately control.
How did Indian rulers initially react to them?
They generally welcomed them as just another group of merchants, granting them the same trading rights as others. However, they quickly disliked the Portuguese insistence on monopoly and their aggressive tactics.
So they welcomed competitors later.
Yes, rulers were often happy to see other Europeans, Dutch, English, French, arrive later, hoping to play them off against the Portuguese and break their control.
Was the potential for European land intervention recognized early on?
Apparently not. The source suggests Indian rulers underrated this threat initially. The Portuguese seemed primarily a sea power, focused on controlling trade routes. Large-scale military expeditions inland seemed unlikely, partly because the monsoon climate made supplying armies overland very difficult for naval powers.
What changed that equation?
The turning point, the source argues, came later, when Europeans initially, the French, then the British, started training Indian soldiers, sepoys, in European infantry tactics and paying them regularly with money brought in by ships. At that point, their potential for intervening effectively in land conflicts increased by leaps and bounds.
The source contrasts the situation the British faced in Western India with Bengal.
Right. Gujarat in the west was historically vital for international trade, but unlike Bengal, it lacked a strong, consolidating figure like Murshid Quli Khan during the period of Mughal decline.
So it was more chaotic.
Yes, the dissolution of the Mughal Empire hit Gujarat hard and fast. Surat, the great Mughal port, declined rapidly as trade routes became insecure. Merchants started fleeing, seeking the relative safety of Bombay under British protection, even though Bombay wasn't ideal.
Why wasn't Bombay ideal?
It had a great natural harbor, but its connection to the hinterland was poor because of the Western Ghats mountain range. Surat was much better situated for trade access. But for the Indian merchants facing raids from decaying Mughal forces and rising Maratha power, safety trumped geographical convenience. The source views the 18th century, that period before clear British dominance emerged, through a familiar lens.
Which is?
The lens of regional regimes rising and copying the style and structures of the declining imperial center, in this case, the Mughals. It draws a parallel to what happened centuries earlier after the decline of the Gupta Empire.
So figures like the Nawabs of Bengal and Oudh, the Nizam of Hyderabad.
Exactly. They carved out effectively independent states, but maintained Mughal titles and administrative forms. Meanwhile, the Marathas conquered western India, and the south remained fragmented among various rulers descended from the Vijayanagara system.
And the Europeans in the mid-18th century, still peripheral.
Largely, yes. By around 1750, this regional division of power seemed relatively stable, or at least accepted. Yeah. The European powers were still mostly confined to their coastal trading posts, controlling very little territory directly. Their potential for intervention seemed modest. Indian rulers were probably more worried about threats from the north, like the Afghan raids led by Ahmad Shah Durrani.
So how did the Europeans, particularly the British and French, get drawn more deeply into Indian conflicts?
Two main factors, according to the source. First, wars between Britain and France and Europe inevitably spilled over into India, where their trading companies were rivals. Yeah. Second, and crucially, they increasingly became partners or mercenaries, really for Indian rulers who were fighting amongst themselves.
And the French governor Dupleix was key here.
Joseph-François Dupleix, the governor of Pondicherry, is highlighted as a particularly astute, if ultimately unsuccessful, player in this game. He was a master diplomat, playing rival Indian princes off against each other, making the most of his limited resources.
What was his key military innovation?
His crucial idea, adopted by the British too, was training those Indian sepoys as disciplined infantry drilled in the latest European methods.
Why was this so effective?
Because this force was relatively cheap to maintain compared to European troops, but it could consistently defeat much larger traditional Indian armies, especially cavalry. Indian cavalry relied on the individual bravery of horsemen charging often ill-equipped peasant infantry. They were simply mowed down by volleys from disciplined lines of foot soldiers firing muskets in unison. The source makes a powerful comparison here. Just as Babur used his combination of firearms and cavalry to found the Mughal Empire. This European-trained sepoy infantry became the tool that founded European dominance in India. The sepoy wasn't necessarily superior weapons. Muskets were available to Indians, but, the source stresses, entirely in its drill and organization.
Indian generals didn't adapt.
Apparently not quickly enough. The source suggests their ingrained cavalry mentality made them underestimate the power of this new infantry. They respected enemies on horseback, not foot soldiers. This failure to adapt made the European subversion of Indian warfare much easier.
This led to the companies fighting each other directly using Indian allies.
Yes. The War of Austrian Succession in Europe forced them into conflict in India. Dupleix initially tried to arrange neutrality, the source notes, which the British accepted, but with a crucial caveat about any royal troops sent from Europe.
So fighting was inevitable.
Pretty much. Dupleix was forced into hostilities and had some initial successes, even capturing Madras with the help of the French Admiral Le Bourdonnais. But disputes between the two men led to Le Bourdonnais sailing away, and Madras was eventually returned to the British by the peace treaty in 1748.
But the conflict didn't really stop.
No, both sides kept their troops, including the sepoys, and continued the game of warfare, often getting drawn into the internal succession disputes or expansionist ambitions of Indian rulers who invited them in.
The Battle of Buxar in 1764 seems like a real turning point in the source's narrative.
It's presented as absolutely decisive. Shuja-ud-Dowla, the powerful Nawab of Oudh, decided to challenge the British. He was joined by Mir Qasim, the former Nawab of Bengal, who had been installed but then alienated by the British East India Company's rampant corruption and plunder.
So a major coalition against the British.
A large army, yes. They faced a much smaller company force under Major Hector Munro at Buxar near the border of Bihar and UP.
And the result?
A decisive British victory. Munro pursued Shuja-ud-Dowla all the way to Lucknow and eventually captured him. The source makes a strong claim here. Buxar decided what the Battle of Panipat in 1761 between Marathas and Afghans had failed to settle. After the main Indian contenders had effectively weakened or eliminated each other in previous conflicts, the British won the crucial round against the remaining major North Indian power. Robert Clive returned to India, and the company forced the Mughal emperor to grant them the Diwani the right to collect the revenues of Bengal, Bihar, and Orissa.
What happened to Shuja-ud-Dowla?
He was reinstated as Nawab of Oudh, but effectively became an instrument of British policy. He had to cede territory to the Mughal emperor, who himself was now living as a British pensioner in Allahabad. Buxar really cemented British power in eastern India. The source also identifies several underlying factors beyond just military tactics and organization that contributed to the British success.
Such as the Bengal trade.
Yes, the highly profitable trade in Bengal textiles was crucial. It was a complex, specialized business requiring deep knowledge of local conditions. Company agents managed to keep the cloth flowing even during periods of chaos, like Maratha raids, by shifting supply lines.
And they had expertise.
Some British soldiers were apparently weavers themselves and worked as experts for the company. Also, the constant flow of silver needed to pay for this cloth helped to monetize the regional economy, including land revenue, which ironically made Indian rulers more tolerant of the company's presence initially.
And financial management.
Critically important. The source states the British understood military finance in a way most Indian rulers never mastered. Indian warrior leaders were often personally brave but improvident, frequently unable to pay their troops reliably, leading to mutinies and instability. The company, backed by global trade and London finance, could maintain paid, disciplined forces more consistently. The British also played a shrewd game, limiting their own direct military engagement where possible, leveraging conflicts between Indian states. Similar tactics were used in European balance of power politics, but with a key difference.
What was the difference?
In Europe, the goal was usually to maintain a balance. In India, the British consistently used these conflicts as opportunities to annex territory and eliminate rivals one by one. India, the source suggests, had powerful soloists, but lacked Europe's concert of powers that could unite against a rising hegemon.
And the company itself adapted its identity.
Yes, holding the legal title of Dian from the Mughal emperor gave them legitimacy. They became more ruler than trader. even adopting the curious local title Company Bahadur, the hero company or brave company, presenting themselves almost as a collective entity inheriting the mantle of the declining Mughal Empire.
The source then covers the transition towards more direct British rule, mentioning things like the Regulating Act of 1784.
Right, Pitt's India Act, technically. It reformed the company's governance structure. It gave the Governor-General in India considerable, almost autocratic power locally. But it established a powerful board of control back in London, appointed by the Crown, to oversee the company's political activities. There was also a secret committee of secrecy within the company's directors that could issue binding orders, bypassing even other directors.
How effective was this structure?
The source calls it well-suited for managing an empire at a distance. The Governor-General had freedom to act quickly. Long communication delays helped, while the boarding committee in London set overall policy and mediated between the autocratic system needed in India and the parliamentary system back in Britain. Trade matters were kept somewhat separate.
So it facilitated the shift from trade to rule.
Yes, it provided a stable framework for that gradual transition. The company's trade monopoly was eventually abolished, 1813 for India trade, later for China, and its primary economic interest became managing the transfer of India's revenues, essentially tribute back to Britain. And they developed sophisticated financial methods for this tribute transfer. It wasn't just shipping gold and silver.
How did it work?
They used complex international transactions. For example, using Indian tax revenues or profits from the opium trade, forced on India, sold in China, to buy tea in China, which was then shipped and sold profitably in London. Or private British traders shipping Indian cotton to China would deposit their earnings with the company's office in Canton, receiving bills of exchange, drafts, payable in London or Calcutta. This multi-cornered trade was more efficient and profitable than just direct bullion shipments.
Land revenue settlements were another cornerstone of British rule. The source discusses the permanent settlement in Bengal.
Implemented by Lord Cornwallis in 1793, the source makes an important point. Cornwallis wasn't just blindly implementing a plan proposed earlier by Philip Francis. He was tackling an immediate pressing problem.
What problem?
A severe shortage of cultivators in Bengal following the devastating famine of 1770. There were vagrant peasants roaming the land, and landlords, zamindars, were competing fiercely to attract scarce labor to work their lands.
How did this affect revenue?
Zamindars were complaining they couldn't collect the revenue demanded by the company because peasants kept absconding. It created huge uncertainty for the state's finances.
So the permanent settlement aimed to fix this?
Yes. The 1793 regulation did two key things. First, it fixed the government's land revenue demand from the zamindar permanently, in perpetuity. Second, it made the zamindar solely responsible for paying that fixed amount on time, regardless of what they collected from tenants. If they failed, their entire estate would be ruthlessly auctioned off.
What happened to the issue of absconding peasants?
It suddenly became irrelevant to the state. The state got its fixed revenue from the zamindar. Whether the zamindar could collect rent from his tenants became purely a private matter between landlord and tenant. This massively improved the predictability of the state budget. The initial assessment wasn't lenient. Many zamindars lost their estates early on, but over the longer term, as population grew and cultivation expanded, zamindars were able to increase rents significantly. They pocketed this unearned increment, as the economist Ricardo would call it, often without necessarily becoming the improving landlords the British had hoped for.
Did they apply this permanent settlement everywhere?
No. The source links Cornwallis's push for it in Bengal directly to his need for reliable finances to fund wars, like the one against Tipu Sultan in the south. Where efficient systems of direct revenue assessment already existed, as established by Tipu Sultan himself in parts of South India, the British often kept that system, later known as Ryotwari, and didn't introduce the permanent settlement or create a landlord class in the same way.
British rule also coincided with major economic shifts linked to the Industrial Revolution back in Britain.
Absolutely. Napoleon's blockade of Europe, cutting off markets, combined with rising industrial production in England, drastically reduced the demand for traditional Indian exports like textiles.
Source gives figures.
Yes. Bengal textile exports fell sharply from 1.4 million in 1800 down to 0.9 million by 1809. At the same time, imports of British manufactured goods into India soared from 6 million to 18 million over the same period, a dramatic reversal of trade flows. Rural areas, especially in eastern India, Bengal, Bihar, were transformed into producers of export cash crops for the global market, things like indigo for dyes, opium for the forced China trade, and jute for sacking. Assam was developed as a major tea-producing region.
Who organized this trade?
Large British-owned managing agencies based in Calcutta. They controlled vast networks, plantations, shipping lines, jute mills, coal mines, connecting Indian primary production directly to the world market dominated by Britain.
Did these agencies have political influence?
Significant influence, the source notes. They represented the main European commercial pressure group in India. There were relatively few independent European settlers, and wielded considerable clout with the government of India.
The source also mentions the Babu in this context.
Yes, the educated Bengali clerk, often resented in other parts of India as instruments of British rule, a kind of sub-imperialism. But, the source notes, they were welcomed by the British as essential clerical infrastructure. Ruling an empire required not just the sword, but also the pen, and the Babus provided that administrative backbone.
The source also details the Rayatwari system used in places like the Bombay Presidency. How did that work?
This was presented by the British as a more radical and equitable system, where the state bypassed intermediaries and assessed land revenue directly with the individual peasant cultivator, the Rayat.
Were they proud of this system?
Very proud, especially of its supposed scientific accuracy. It was based on detailed land surveys using military mapping techniques and classifying soil quality down to tiny plots. Bombay Presidency officers were notoriously strict in applying it.
Strict how?
They generally refused to grant remissions of revenue even in bad harvest years, only allowing temporary suspension of payment. To grant remission would be admitting their scientific assessment was faulty. This incredibly tough system was only made workable, the source suggests, because village moneylenders provided credit to peasants, often specifically to pay their government revenue arrears. This, however, led to massive rural indebtedness and eventually sparked peasant riots in the Deccan in 1875 near Pune.
Did the riots change the system?
Not fundamentally, no, partly because the disturbances were confined to only a few districts. This source makes an interesting observation here. India's sheer size and regional diversity often saved the British from facing large-scale, unified confrontations.
And the administrative process itself played a role.
Yes, the very slowness of the revenue settlement machinery, the teams revising assessments district by district, often taking a whole year per district, meant that different areas had different revenue histories and grievances. Problems tended to emerge at different times in different places. The source says this worked as if it had been designed for divide and rule, even if it wasn't necessarily a conscious, deliberate policy in that specific instance. It fragmented potential opposition.
The role of the army is obviously central to maintaining British rule.
Absolutely. The source highlights the increased British focus on recruiting soldiers from the Punjab, especially after the 1857 mutiny. Punjabi soldiers played a crucial role in suppressing the mutiny and became seen as the bedrock for holding India by the sword.
Did the mutiny change the army's composition?
Yes, it taught the British a hard lesson. They significantly increased the proportion of British troops stationed in India relative to Indian sepoys, although this was very expensive.
What were the numbers roughly?
In the late 19th century, the army had about 140,000 Indian soldiers and 70,000 British soldiers. But the cost of maintaining a British soldier was much higher. Plus, the high salaries and generous pensions paid to the British officer corps commanding the Indian troops contributed significantly to the home charges expenses incurred in Britain but billed to the Indian taxpayer.
Moving towards the independence movement, the source briefly touches on early constitutional reforms, like the Morley-Minto reforms of 1909.
Yes, and it notes how the introduction of separate electorates for Muslims, while perhaps seeming like a fair compromise for minority representation when the legislature was purely advisory or oppositional, would become deeply problematic later once India moved towards a parliamentary system where the executive government depended on commanding a majority in that legislature. It sowed the seeds for future conflict. The source also contrasts regional variations in early nationalism. The Dravidian South, it notes, wasn't initially stirred by the same kind of nationalist movements found elsewhere.
Why was that?
Several factors are suggested. Fewer large urban centers compared to the north or west, the plurality of languages, the presence of large princely states where nationalist politics had little scope, and significant social distance between the educated Brahmin elite and the non-Brahmin majority.
So what kind of nationalism emerged there initially?
Southern Brahmins tended towards a more moderate, liberal form of nationalism, becoming important allies for liberals in the north against more radical or revolutionary elements within the Indian National Congress.
The source highlights a significant shift in the political stance of Indian Muslims, particularly during World War I.
Yes, this was crucial. Many Indian Muslims felt a strong religious loyalty to the Turkish Sultan, who was also the caliph, the nominal head of the global Muslim community.
And Britain was fighting Turkey in the war.
Exactly. This put Indian Muslims in a difficult position. Before the war, many had looked to the British government as protectors of their minority rights against a Hindu majority. Now, their British rulers were fighting their caliph.
So they moved closer to the nationalists.
They did. This period saw a growing alignment between the Muslim League and the Congress. It's reflected in Muhammad Ali Jinnah, then a prominent nationalist, leading the Muslim League along nationalist lines and forging the Congress League Pact of 1916 in Lucknow with Bal Gangadhar Tilak.
What did the pact involve?
Congress agreed to separate electorates for Muslims in provincial councils, and both organizations agreed on a common platform demanding constitutional reforms. During the war years, the source notes, Congress and the League often held their annual sessions in the same city, coordinating their strategies along parallel lines.
1917 is described as a moment of unique national solidarity, but one that also led to a split.
Yes, the 1917 Congress session showed remarkable unity, partly fueled by the British arresting and then releasing the popular Theosophist leader, Annie Besant. She became a hero and dominated the session with her message of home rule.
But a split followed.
Yes, over the Montagu-Chelmsford reforms announced by the British, Tilak and C.R. Das vehemently opposed the reforms as inadequate, demanding full provincial autonomy immediately. The more moderate leaders, however, wanted to work within the proposed reform framework.
Who won within Congress?
Tilak and Das controlled the Congress machinery at that point. The moderates, feeling sidelined, broke away and formed their own party, the National Liberal Federation. But this whole debate about the reforms was soon overshadowed by Mahatma Gandhi launching the non-cooperation movement.
Which was welcomed by the Khilafatists, those agitated about the caliphate issue.
Yes, they strongly supported it, but many within the mainstream Congress were initially quite skeptical. A special session of Congress was held in Calcutta in September 1920 to debate Gandhi's resolution for non-cooperation. The source notes Tilak had died just shortly before.
Gandhi missed his support.
Gandhi's comment, "My strongest bulwark is gone," is called an enigma by the source. It speculates he might have thought Tilak would back him, despite their differences. Gandhi certainly wasn't sure he had a majority for his radical plan.
So how did the resolution pass?
Surprisingly, the proposal to boycott the upcoming elections held under the new reforms was supported by many prospective candidates themselves.
Why would they boycott elections they might contest?
The source suggests they perhaps foresaw limited success anyway, given the changed franchise and the departure of the Liberals. A boycott offered a convenient alibi for potential failure. Congress politicians faced a real dilemma. The franchise had been extended to new groups of voters they didn't necessarily know or control, while their traditional upper-class voters might now favor the Liberals who had left Congress. In this uncertain situation, non-cooperation seemed the least risky, perhaps most face-saving option for many.
And Gandhi sweetened the deal.
He added the promise of achieving Swaraj self-rule in 1 year to the resolution, a bold, almost mystical claim. Even then, it passed with only a narrow majority in Calcutta.
But it was endorsed later.
Yes, at the regular annual Congress session in Nagpur later that year, December 1920. By then, many who had opposed it in Calcutta had withdrawn, and the liberals who might have argued for working the reforms had already left the party. Non-cooperation was basically the only strategy left on the table, and it was endorsed almost unanimously.
How did the movement fare in 1921? Did the energy last?
It faded quite quickly, according to the source. It suggests the movement would likely have just petered out on its own.
But something revived it.
Briefly, yes. The British government made the rather clumsy decision to send the Prince of Wales on a royal tour of India, which predictably provoked protests and briefly re-energized the agitation.
How did the government handle Gandhi himself?
With a skillful strategy, the source calls it. They largely refrained from harsh repression and pointedly did not arrest Gandhi, even though he seemed to be courting arrest.
Why wait?
They waited until the movement itself provided the justification. When a mob of protesters turned violent at Chari Chara in UP, burning policemen alive in a police station, Gandhi himself called off the entire non-cooperation movement, horrified by the violence.
And then the British acted.
Promptly arrested him. At his trial, he refused to offer a defense, gave a famous statement explaining his transition from loyalist to rebel, and accepted the same sentence previously given to Tilak. He was released after 2 years on health grounds, and the source notes many contemporaries thought his political career was effectively over at that point.
But he returned later, resuming civil disobedience after the disappointment of the Round Table conferences in London.
Yes, this phase included a significant no-rent campaign, particularly in North India.
Where was it most active?
Interestingly, the source notes that the rice-growing regions, like eastern UP and Bihar, became more active this time, while the wheat-growing regions that were prominent earlier quieted down.
Why the difference?
In Bihar, tensions were particularly high because landlords had the power to evict tenants for non-payment of rent and thereby recover valuable occupancy rights that tenants held. This created intense class conflict, leading to the rise of the militant Kisan Sabha peasant association with strong socialist and communist involvement.
What about elsewhere?
Coastal Andhra also had large landlords, but tenants there were apparently in a stronger legal position regarding occupancy rights. So the movement there, while effective, was less radical and violent. The source notes Gandhi himself remained uncomfortable with campaigns that actively encouraged class struggle among Indians. The source also revisits the dilemma Congress faced after the 1937 provincial elections, held under a new constitution granting more provincial autonomy.
About whether to accept office, to form governments?
Exactly. Congress won majorities in most provinces, but initially refused to form ministries, demanding assurances from the British governors that they wouldn't misuse their emergency override powers.
What was the effect of this refusal?
It allowed minority governments, often composed of splinter parties, to take office temporarily. Ironically, these weak governments sometimes got credit for implementing popular policies from the Congress election manifesto. This situation made the more conservative, right-wing leaders within Congress very impatient. The deadlock was broken when the governor of Madras supposedly gave a private assurance to C. Rajagopalachari, the Madras Congress leader, about not misusing emergency powers. This was taken as the signal for Congress to accept office across the country.
Why was Rajagopalachari particularly eager in Madras?
Partly because the refusal of Congress to take office had allowed the rival non-Brahmin Justice Party, which Congress had decisively defeated in the election, to sneak back into power temporarily. He wanted them out.
World War II brought further major shifts.
Yes. India was declared a belligerent party in the war by the viceroy without any consultation with Indian political leaders.
How did Congress react?
The Congress ministries, which had only been in office for about 2 years, resigned in protest in late 1939. The Muslim League, under Jinnah, celebrated this as a day of deliverance from Hindu rule.
And Congress leaders during the war?
Most were arrested and imprisoned following the launch of the Quit India movement in August 1942.
The source also mentions the tragic Bengal famine of 1943.
Yes, highlighting the horrific situation where millions died, sometimes within sight of hoarded sacks of rice that they couldn't afford or didn't dare take due to the rigorous enforcement of law and order. The source criticizes the British government for not intervening with grain distributions soon enough. And amidst all this, the dramatic but ultimately unsuccessful attempt by Subhas Chandra Bose to achieve liberation with external help.
Bose escaping India to seek Axis support.
Yes, organizing the Indian National Army, INA, primarily from Indian prisoners of war captured by the Japanese. The INA briefly fought alongside the Japanese and reached Indian soil during the ill-fated Burma campaign, but was forced into retreat.
How does the source characterize his effort?
As something that fired the imagination of many Indians, but ultimately burnt out like a meteor, Bose himself died in a plane crash before the war ended.
The source then returns to the rise of the Muslim League and the demand for Pakistan, especially its acceleration after the 1937 elections.
Right. Those elections were actually a setback for the League in the Muslim-majority provinces. In British India as a whole, the League won only about a quarter of the seats reserved for Muslims, while various provincial Muslim parties won nearly 70%.
So Jinnah was isolated.
With Congress firmly in power in the Hindu-majority provinces and the League confined to opposition, Jinnah felt left out in the cold, as the source puts it. This pushed him to focus his efforts on the Muslim-majority provinces where the League had fared poorly.
And the idea of Pakistan.
The source suggests that the idea of a separate state, Pakistan originally conceived by student Rahmat Ali, grew on Jinnah during this period of political isolation. The Urdu press picked up the term, spreading Pakistan as a familiar slogan among Muslims even before its political implications were fully defined.
Fast forward to 1946, and the attempts to form an interim government before independence.
A very tense period. The source mentions the shock of the Direct Action Day, called by the Muslim League, in August 1946, which led to horrific communal riots, particularly in Calcutta.
Did this stop the viceroy, Wavell?
No, ironically, the source suggests the violence made Wavell even more eager to get an interim government formed, partly to share the burden of maintaining law and order with Indian politicians.
So Nehru's Congress-led cabinet was sworn in.
Yes, on September 2nd, 1946, Jinnah initially refused to join, but then agreed to let the Muslim League participate, sending Liaquat Ali Khan, his right-hand man, instead of joining himself.
How did Congress accommodate the League?
They gave up the crucial finance portfolio to Liaquat Ali Khan, keeping home affairs for themselves. Liaquat then reportedly used his powers as finance minister to obstruct the functioning of the Congress ministries, creating constant friction within the government. The path to partition was becoming increasingly likely.
The source then jumps ahead quite significantly into the era of the Republic of India, discussing Rajiv Gandhi's time as prime minister in the mid-1980s.
Yes, it notes some of his early initiatives. He introduced a budget with significant tax cuts, signaling a move towards a more liberalized economy aimed at stimulating private enterprise.
And he tackled some long-running regional conflicts.
He did. He managed to reach accords in 1985 to address the unrest in Assam and, more significantly, in Punjab, which led to elections being held in those states.
But the Punjab Accord ultimately failed, didn't it?
Yes, tragically. Sandharchand Singh Langal, the moderate Akali Dal leader who signed the accord with Rajiv Gandhi, was assassinated by Sikh extremists shortly afterwards.
Did the Akali Dal win the subsequent election?
They did, and Surjit Singh Barnala became chief minister. But his government was hamstrung and eventually dismissed, with president's rule being imposed in Punjab in 1987.
Why did the accord fail so badly?
The source points to Rajiv Gandhi's inability to deliver on a key promise, transferring the city of Chandigarh, joint capital of Punjab and Haryana, exclusively to Punjab by January 1986. It didn't happen, largely due to opposition from the government of neighboring Haryana.
What was the political fallout?
It made both Gandhi and Barnala lose considerable face. Gandhi seemed reluctant to alienate voters in Haryana ahead of their state elections in 1987, but Congress lost badly there anyway to the regional Lokdal party, whose leader, Devi Lal, effectively used the unfolding Bofors arms deal scandal against Gandhi.
The 1989 general elections marked a significant shift in national politics.
A major change. Congress lost heavily across North India, though it remained strong in the South. Crucially, they didn't win enough seats to form a government on their own.
So Rajiv Gandhi resigned.
Yes, and VP Singh, who had left Congress earlier, formed a minority government leading the National Front coalition, which had far fewer seats than Congress.
Why didn't Congress lead a coalition? They were still the largest party.
The source notes that under normal convention, Gandhi probably would have been invited to try, but the entire opposition campaign had been focused on ousting him, so the other parties simply refused to join a Congress-led coalition. At the same time, the deep incompatibilities within the opposition prevented them from forming a full coalition government themselves. It was similar in some ways to 1977, when Indira Gandhi was ousted. But back then, the opposition parties had actually merged into the Janata Party, an experiment that had failed quickly and wasn't repeated in 1989.
So a full coalition wasn't viable.
The source suggests a coalition might have been more logical in 1989, but the political conditions weren't quite ripe. Congress, despite being the strongest party, was historically averse to coalitions, as it would compromise its central position by forcing it to choose partners from the left or right.
So VP Singh led a minority government supported from outside.
Yes, precariously tolerated by both the communists on the left and, significantly, the Bharatiya Janata Party, BJP, on the right.
And the BJP's performance was notable.
Absolutely. The source highlights their dramatic jump from just 2 seats in the previous election to 108 seats in 1989. It attributes this success almost solely to the electoral pact they had with VP Singh's National Front, which involved seat adjustments and mutual toleration, though not mandatory support for the government.
The source touches on the economic changes in the early 1990s following the 1991 balance of payments crisis.
Yes, a definite shift in atmosphere with the economic liberalization policies introduced by the Narasimha Rao government. Non-resident Indians started sending more money back.
What about trade and investment?
A significant devaluation of the rupee, around 18%, boosted exports and helped attract foreign investment. However, the source notes much of this initial foreign investment was institutional, flowing into the stock market, rather than direct investment in new factories or businesses, the primary market.
But this influx caused problems.
It fueled increased speculation, which, combined with imperfections in the financial markets, led to a major stock market scam orchestrated by Harshad Mehta, causing a market collapse in 1992.
1992 is also marked by a deeply tragic event mentioned in the source, Ayodhya.
Yes, the destruction of the Babri Masjid, a 16th century mosque in Ayodhya on December 6, 1992. The source calls it a tragic day.
What led up to it?
The BJP had resumed its political campaign focused on building a Ram temple on the site, which they claimed was Ram's birthplace. They were in a stronger position now as they controlled the state government in Uttar Pradesh, where Ayodhya is located.
What happened on the day?
A huge crowd of activists, mobilized by the BJP and associated organizations, converged on Ayodhya. The source suggests the BJP leadership probably didn't intend for the mosque to be completely demolished that day. Doing so would lose them a potent political symbol. But the massive crowd got into a frenzy.
And destroyed the structure.
Yes. The source calls the destruction carried out by innumerable hands equipped with only the most elementary instruments, an astonishing feat of collective action that left the nation dumbfounded. The source notes that typical BJP voters were generally middle class and not inclined towards disrupting law and order. Following the demolition, Prime Minister Narasimha Rao controversially advised dismissing not just the UP government, which could be held directly responsible, but all 4 BJP-led state governments.
How did that play out?
Initially, it seemed a hasty move that might backfire and help the BJP consolidate support. But the BJP actually became quite defensive. A planned rally in Delhi in February 1993 flopped, and when elections were held in the 4 dismissed states in November 1993, the BJP suffered decisive losses. Narasimha Rao's calculation seemed vindicated, and he reached the peak of his political power, managing to secure a working majority for his previously precarious government.
The source briefly covers India's foreign policy, starting back with Nehru's efforts at international mediation.
Yes, Nehru saw a role for newly independent India on the world stage. His first notable success, according to the source, was during the Korean War, where his communications with Stalin and U.S. Secretary of State Dean Acheson helped play a constructive role, particularly in resolving the issue of prisoner of war repatriation.
He tried again later.
Yes, at the 1954 Geneva Conference on Indochina, trying to find a peaceful resolution after the French defeat. His envoy, Krishna Menon, was apparently crucial in behind-the-scenes negotiations.
Was it successful?
Initially, it seemed so. Both the U.S. and the Soviet Union favored the neutralization of Indochina at that point, and India was chosen to chair the International Control Commission set up to oversee the agreement.
There's a catch.
Simultaneously, the U.S. was sponsoring the creation of the Southeast Asia Treaty Organization, SEATO, a military alliance aimed against communist expansion, which Pakistan promptly joined. Nehru and Menon were furious, seeing this as directly undermining the goal of neutralizing conflict in the region.
What lesson did they learn?
The source notes it became obvious that mediation was often a thankless task when it ran up against the core interests of the superpowers. Despite this setback, 1955 is described as a period of apparent harmony, with Nehru attending the Bandung Conference of Non-Aligned Nations and seemingly at the height of his international influence.
Relations with Pakistan are also covered, obviously a key aspect of foreign policy.
Yes. The source points to 1960 as a brief high point, with the signing of the Indus Waters Treaty, brokered by the World Bank, and seemingly harmonious meetings between Nehru and Pakistan's military ruler Ayub Khan.
But that didn't last.
No. After India's military setback against China in 1962 and Nehru's subsequent declining health and influence, Pakistan moved to establish friendly ties with China in 1963. Zulfikar Ali Bhutto, then foreign minister, was the architect of this shift and took an increasingly hard line towards India.
Tensions rose again?
Yes. After Nehru died in 1964, Ayub Khan and Bhutto apparently saw an opportunity to settle scores. The source describes the brief conflict in the run of Kutch in 1965 as India's new prime minister, Lal Bahadur Shastri, walking into a trap. Pakistan chose a time when the Ren, a salt marsh, was flooded, putting Indian troops at a disadvantage. Shastri agreed to mediation, with British PM Harold Wilson acting as mediator. This was seen as a precursor to the larger Indo-Pak War later that year. India's involvement in Sri Lanka's ethnic conflict is another example of complex foreign engagement discussed.
India initially supported Tamil militant groups.
Yes, particularly after the anti-Tamil pogroms in Sri Lanka in 1983, Sri Lanka's President Jayewardene tried to gear up his small army with foreign assistance for a military solution, but it was proving ineffective against the Tamil guerrillas.
What prompted direct Indian intervention?
When the Sri Lankan army closed in on the Tamil stronghold of Jafta in 1987, India controversially airdropped supplies to the besieged city. Jayewardene protested but then signed an accord with Rajiv Gandhi in July 1987.
What did the accord entail?
It led to the deployment of the Indian Peacekeeping Force, IPKF, to Sri Lanka, supposedly to disarm the Tamil militants, primarily the LTTE, Tamil Tigers.
Did that work?
No, it failed disastrously. The IPKF ended up fighting a protracted war against the LTTE, suffering severe losses in terms of soldiers, money, and international reputation.
How did it end?
Jaywardene's successor, President Premadasa, facing pressure from Sinhala nationalist extremists, eventually gave India an ultimatum to withdraw the IPKF by July 1989. A new agreement postponed the final withdrawal slightly, but the intervention was widely seen as a costly failure. The source notes that even as this was unfolding, India remained deeply involved elsewhere, for example, having to support the communist regime in Kabul following the Soviet withdrawal from Afghanistan in 1989, adding to its regional burdens.
Finally, the source concludes by reflecting on some enduring themes it sees in India's long political tradition.
Yes, it discusses the persistent tension between centralism and federalism. The highly centralized traditions inherited from the Mughals, and especially the British, were readily adopted by Indian nationalists after independence.
Why?
Enhanced by the trauma of partition, which created a strong desire for national integration and a powerful central government. This was reinforced by the continuity of the highly centralized civil services, like the IAS.
With what consequence?
The source suggests the developmental needs and potential contributions of strong federal states weren't fully appreciated initially because of this centralizing bias. Only more recently, it argues, is the true value of federalism for managing a country as vast and diverse as India becoming more evident.
And secularism is presented as another key, long-standing element.
Yes. The source argues that traditional Hinduism, despite its social hierarchies, generally allowed for autonomy in the political sphere. Kingship had its own rules. Islamic rulers, while bringing a different concept of the state, ideally as a Muslim corporation, in practice had to accommodate the vast non-Muslim majority. The British, focused on governance and profit, didn't attempt to create a Christian empire.
And the Indian National Congress
took great care from early on to define itself as a secular organization representing all Indians regardless of religion. This was partly ideological but also pragmatic. Any overt sectarianism risked alienating potential supporters and isolating the movement.
Did British policies affect this?
Yes. The source argues British policies like divide and rule, and especially the introduction of separate electorates, which ultimately contributed to partition, actually reinforced the INC's commitment to secularism as the only way to hold India together.
So secularism became foundational for the Republic.
It became the guiding principle of the independent Union of India. Jawaharlal Nehru, the first prime minister, saw the secular republic as the true school for forging the diverse communities of India into a modern nation. This process of nation-building, the source concludes, is complex, faces obstacles, and is still going on, requiring concerted action.
Wow, that really was an incredible journey through millennia. We've gone from stone tools and ancient cities through empires rising and falling, the richness of medieval kingdoms, profound cultural and religious shifts, the impact of invasions and trade, colonial transformation, and the immense challenges and achievements of the modern republic, all drawn from the material you brought for us.
It absolutely highlights just how many layers there are to understanding India's past, doesn't it? You've got the fundamental geography, the grand sweep of empires, but also the deep social changes, the philosophical currents, the religious movements, and that constant complex interaction with outside forces and ideas.
And we definitely saw patterns repeating, like that cycle of centralization followed by the resurgence of regional powers, or the way different eras saw the adoption and adaptation of foreign innovations, whether it was iron tools, new military tactics, or political ideas.
And those enduring themes the source brought out right at the end, that constant push and pull between central authority and regional dynamics, and the massive ongoing project of building a unified nation out of such staggering diversity, reflected in that commitment to secularism, they feel incredibly relevant today.
They really do. So as you, our listener, reflect on everything we've unpacked in this deep dive, drawing entirely from the source material provided, here's a final provocative thought to leave you with. Given India's long, complex history, featuring both incredibly strong centralized states and equally persistent, powerful regional identities, and this constant adaptation of both internal structures and external influences, what specific historical examples or periods we've discussed today might offer the most compelling clues about the delicate balance between unity and diversity that India continues to navigate in the 21st century?
Keep digging into those sources, keep asking the big questions, and keep making those connections across time. That's really what exploring history like this is all about.
Thanks so much for joining us for this deep dive.
Until next time.